We are live. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Great Oil Debate. Today, I have two esteemed guests to discuss one of the most debated topics in the health and nutrition world. That's olive oil. Is it healthy? Should it be avoided altogether? Or is it fine to enjoy in moderation? Well, let's find out. I'm going to introduce our two plant-based rock stars, as Rip likes to say. Mm-hmm. So first, as a former world-class triathlete and firefighter, Rip saw firsthand how food can be the difference between thriving and merely surviving. In an effort to help his fellow firefighters, he introduced them to the whole food plant-based lifestyle, proving that real lasting health isn't about gimmicks, but about fueling your body the right way. Following in the footsteps of his father, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, Rip spent his career making the case for plant-based nutrition as a tool for preventing and reversing heart disease. Today, he's the founder of PLANTSTRONG Foods, has been a key voice in Forks Over Knives, a multiple-time New York Times bestselling author, and he continues to educate, inspire, and challenge the myths that keep people from achieving optimal health. And today, he's here to do just that. So taking on one of the biggest debates in nutrition, oil, is it a health food or is it holding us back? So right now, my friends, I am going to enable the chat for you people that are tuning in and give Rip some love in the comments. So feel free to chat away. The chat is now open. And here it comes. Look at all these awesome comments coming in. Great stuff. We got a little bit of a delay here too as well. So I'm going to leave it open for you guys. All right. Next up. Oh, this is so nice. So many great comments coming in. Good stuff. Holy cow, they've got a lot.
I saw the question about beef tallow already.
So much. It's going to come in. This is all love, folks. All love. Pittsburgh is here. Hello from New Jersey. Yes, folks, this is live. So, Rip, there's tons of love coming in. There we go. All right, I'm going to disable the chat as we introduce our next speaker. As a leading bariatric surgeon, Dr. Davis has spent his career on the front lines of weight loss and disease prevention, helping thousands of patients transform their health. He's seen firsthand what works, what doesn't, and the importance of real science-backed solutions. As a longtime advocate for plant-based nutrition, Dr. Davis has never shied away from a challenging trend, including the idea that all oils are bad for our health. With a deep understanding of metabolism, satiety, and the science of weight management, he's here to set the record straight. Oil can be a part of a healthy, balanced diet. As the author of Proteinaholic, a respected surgeon, a dedicated athlete, Dr. Davis doesn't just study nutrition, he lives it. And today he's here to bring the research, the science, and the real-world experience to the debate. I'm going to open up the comments again, give some love to Dr. Garth Davis. And I just want to personally say how honored Forks Over Knives is to have both of you attend. This is something that whenever we talk about it, it is always a hot topic among our audience. And we just both really look forward to having an awesome discussion. I said to both of you, there's really no winners in this debate. This is really just an opportunity to have a great discussion and allow people to take away the information and make their own decision on what's going to be best for them. So I thank you both so much for being here.
Sure. One of my friends, he messaged me and he was like, I'm going to try and be on there, but he works for an oil company, like drilling oil. And he's like, I can't believe you're the debate. You're not an expert on drilling oil. I'm going to ride you. I was like, I'm not debating drilling oil. I'm debating olive oil. And he's who debates olive oil? This is boring.
Oh boy. Well, I tell you, there's almost 10,000 people that would disagree with him who are joining us.
They would disagree, right?
Yeah. So, all right, folks, we're going to get right into it. This is going to try to be a fun, presidential debate format. I'm going to try my best.
Oh, don't say presidential debate. That's not fun.
I'm going to, well, this is one that you would actually enjoy watching. Okay. So this is going to be a great format. We're going to go back and forth. I have 7 questions. We're going to give you guys a chance to answer the question and then the other person will respond. So our first question, we're going to go to Dr. Davis. And this whole food, plant-based, oil-free approach, it's gained popularity as the way to halt or reverse heart disease. So, Dr. Davis, if someone has been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease, should they avoid all culinary oils, including olive oil? Please explain your position.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you, Rip, for being on here too. It's very hard for me to express just how much Rip and his father mean to me. What you guys don't understand is that in 2006, before my first child was born, I went in for a heart test so that I could get approved to get life insurance policy, and I did terrible. I had very high cholesterol, very high triglycerides. I was overweight, had fatty liver, and hypertension. And I didn't know what to do. So I was like, well, I'm not going to just take a bunch of meds. I'm going to study this. And I studied and came to the conclusion that I think a lot of us do when we start studying this, which is I need to be on a whole food plant-based diet. But I didn't know what that meant. And I found Dr. Esselstyn, and it was just oh my God, there's a surgeon like me who understands this. And I went to my first, you didn't call it Engine 2 back then. I can't even remember what it was, but it was in Austin. I met Rip, and I was into, sports too. And I was like, oh my God. And these guys changed my life, and they changed the life of thousands of patients that I've treated ever since. And I learned a lot from them. And for many years, I was staunchly anti-oil for two reasons. Number one, I felt like oil was a high-calorie density food, which we could get into later. And I felt that oil contributed to heart disease, and Dr. Esselstyn had some studies that had convinced me of that. And in my book, Proteinaholic, I talk about we should stay away from oil. But times have changed. And I think it's really important along those lines is that as time changes, we listen to research and we listen to things come out. And specifically, times have changed when it comes to heart disease. We now have some really good studies on olive oil and its effects on heart disease. Specifically, we have just groundbreaking prospective randomized controlled trial looking at primary prevention, which is taking people that are at risk of getting heart disease and seeing what a pretty large increase in olive oil would do to them. That's the PREDIMED study. And for the question you're asking me right now, we have a very good secondary prevention trial, which is to say a secondary prevention trial says someone who has definite heart disease, can we prevent them from getting a heart attack or a second heart attack if they've had one before? There was a study called the Cardio Prov test study. It was looking at 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day versus a teaspoon of olive oil in people that we knew had heart disease. It was a 7-year study. And I mean, the results are fairly clear. I mean, the patients were very compliant with doing the olive oil. We know that not just from food frequency questionnaires, but actually from blood tests. We know that they increased their amount of olive oil consumption from 30 grams to 41 grams. And we know that with that increase, they had a 26% with a median 7-year follow-up, but 26% decrease in the risk of getting a cardiac event. It was even higher in men, up to 32%. And this is followed by many, many other studies. There's been some very large meta-analysis that was looking at different studies, both prospective and randomized controlled trials, showing a definitive benefit with olive oil in preventing cardiac events. And so we could get into the why, but I, at this point, have changed my opinion and now actually believe that olive oil not only can be part of a heart healthy diet, should be part of a heart healthy diet.
Thank you so much for that. I keep hearing the word olive oil, and I keep hearing about these studies. And Rip, I want to give you a chance to respond, but I did want to clarify, Garth, in the studies, were they talking about freshly pressed, fresh harvested olive oil, or are they talking about heating it or cooking with oil? Like how did the oil get presented to these patients?
Yeah, so that's a really good study, right? A really good question, because there's a lot of different studies out there. We've got just plain observation studies, right? So there was a really big study done in Athens called the Attica study, and a study done in a Mediterranean island called Metis, where they were just looking at people who used just no oils at all in their cooking and their eating. Some that used mixed different kinds of oils, and some that used olive oil, and olive oil showed better aging and stuff over time. But they didn't have any idea what kind of olive oil is. We assume that because it's in Greece, it was probably somewhat better, but we don't know. Same with the Harvard Health Study. That's a great study. It shows a benefit to olive oil for sure, especially if you're switching butter out for olive oil. But we don't know what kind of olive oil. Now, in the prospective randomized controlled trials, that's a different story. Now, they are specifically looking at extra virgin olive oil and the effects of extra virgin olive oil on heart disease.
Great. Thank you for that. Rip, your response to cardiovascular disease and olive oil.
Yeah, great. Well, first, thanks for having me, Cory. Thanks to Forks Over Knives. Garth, thank you. You know, when Cory initially suggested doing something of an oil debate, it was supposed to be with Steve Gundry, right? who literally, if you've seen any of his infomercials, he basically is suggesting that you put as much oil on every bit of food that you have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which I absolutely find more than egregious. And so I just want everybody at the very outset to know that, you know, Garth and I are 100% on the same team. We are team whole food, plant-based. And I think this is going to be a great conversation. You know, Garth, to your point, we first met in Austin, Texas. I think it was 2014. And it was at a conference called Food is Medicine. And if I remember correctly, you were kind of toggling between an obesity kind of summit that you were at, where they weren't talking at all.
Good memory. Yeah.
We're talking at all about, you know, about food and nutrition. I think it was mostly surgery. And then, you know, you just came out to me and you're like, this is what it's all about. You were so excited. And then since then, you know, you've been such a wonderful part of PLANTSTRONG, from coming to PlantStock several years, coming to the Sedona immersion. So I just want to say at the outset how much I appreciate you and what you're doing for the movement. You've really turned into a nice, shining leader. So thank you. Now, I also want to say at the outset, so, you know, Garth, you have this up on your Instagram, and I just want to read it. You know, olive oil turns out to probably lower the total and cause specific mortality. This is a science. Sorry if it doesn't fit with your beliefs. We need to learn to adapt and change with new information. And I want to say that I completely agree that the data shows that a whole food plant-based diet with oil can improve health outcomes and decrease mortality risk. But what I would suggest and what I'm proposing is that we don't need the added oils to get those kind of results that you're talking about. And in fact, we can achieve even more robust outcomes without the oils. So that's kind of my position.
Yeah. And that's great, because it kind of brings us into our next question, Rip, which is for those people that don't have heart disease. Would they be healthier if they avoided the added oils altogether? Or can the oils, like olive oil, can it be safely included in a balanced diet? And I think you kind of just answered that question for us.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I'd like to know, like, what is their current diet? Are they paleo, keto, carnivore? You know, what are they wanting to change to? What is their end goal? I think those are all important, you know, questions when someone is considering making some sweeping changes in their diet. But I'm a total believer that a whole food plant-based diet without oils will achieve better results than a whole food plant-based diet with oils. But again, it depends upon where you are on your journey, what makes sense, what is, you know, is easier, what's going to lead to less recidivism. All these questions to me come into play. And, you know, I think as you all know, you know, I was raised in a household, you know, now going on almost 40 years, where we did not consume added oils. And so this has been part of my existence now for, you know, almost 4 decades. And for me, it's just an absolute cinch, right?
Yeah.
It's a piece of kale. So
I, Garth, I want to kind of like give you the chance to respond, and then also take us right into one of my third questions, which has to do with the claim that culinary oils may cause some damage to the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. And I love this question because it gets you in the scientific side of things. And you had mentioned, off camera with me about an endothelial test that now exists. That was pretty fascinating. But what does the science say about the endothelial lining? Should people be concerned about the impact of olive oil and their endothelial function? And I even feel out of place even saying the word endothelial. So I'm going to just turn it over to you and let you talk about that.
You want me to talk about what endothelium is? I mean, endothelium is the lining of the vessel. If you're a surgeon, sometimes, we get it cut and actually see that lining. And we also get to cut and pull, plaque out of those vessels that we see clearly. And if you look at that plaque, it is a combination of inflammatory cells and cholesterol. Cholesterol is a necessary part of that, but what actually gets the cholesterol into the endothelial lining that causes heart disease to begin with? And this is kind of interesting. It has a lot to do with reactive oxygen species, inflammation, blood pressure, things like that. Rip's father, Dr. Esselstyn, was fond of a study many years ago, which concerned me. It was a study done by a man named Dr. Vogel. And Dr. Vogel was actually trying to prove that olive oil was good for you actually at the time. And what he was doing, he was looking at different foods. He would put a blood pressure cuff. And this is how we basically looked at endothelium at the time, as we weren't actually looking at the endothelium. We were looking at the reaction. If you took a blood pressure cuff and you blew it up and then you let it go, how quickly would the blood vessel go up and stay open? It's called flow-mediated dilation test. And he was surprised to find that when he gave people olive oil, they had actually a delay in response, which it does correlate with there possibly being an endothelial problem. And this does correlate with possibly a long-term risk of heart disease. And so Dr. Vogel concluded, I mean, he didn't say olive oil is bad for you or anything like that. He did say this is a concern. That concerned me at the time. And that's why I was anti-oil for a while, because I thought if there's any chance that there's an endothelial lining. But like I said earlier, what have studies done since then? First of all, I don't know what kind of oil. He did say it was extra virgin olive oil, but I have no idea. We know from a recent Consumer Report that there's all kinds of extra virgin olive oils out there that aren't even the least bit extra virgin, right? Some of them don't even have olive oil in them. They've got, mixed with other oils. And so I don't know what Dr. Vogel was using in 1999 when he did this study. There is going to be a big difference. He used 50 grams of olive oil. That's a big dose of olive oil. All right. You give someone 50 grams at one time, there is going to be a transient increase in triglycerides and probably a transient increase in inflammation. And if you don't have the polyphenols that are in an extra virgin olive oil, what your audience has to understand is that the thing about there's good things in olive oil, okay? There's monounsaturated fats. We know that those are pretty good now. We're pretty happy with them. Sure, you could get them from nuts and seeds and other kinds of things like that, but we know those are pretty good. Well, there's squalene and some other stuff we won't get into, but the thing that we are really interested in olive oil are the polyphenols, especially in cold pressed extra virgin olive oil, where you're getting a much higher level of polyphenols, anywhere from 300 to 500. Some people saying 1,000 in their olive oils. If this didn't have those polyphenols, which fight the reactive oxygen species, then you would expect to see a problem with flow-mediated dilation. And since then, like a good buddy of mine, Dr. David Katz, has done the study again, but now he did it with extra virgin olive oil versus regular olive oil. And in this situation, when he used extra virgin olive oil, there was not a delay in flow-mediated dilation. And so it could be possible that either the dose was too high with Dr. Vogel, or that it wasn't actually extra virgin olive oil. Dr. Katz made sure it was extra virgin. In 2015 in Nutrients, they did a really large meta-analysis of every single prospective study looking at endothelial health. And there's many ways of looking at this. Flow-mediated dilation is not the only thing. We could look at endothelin, which is a chemical substance secreted by healthy endothelium. We could look at something, it's a study where we inject arginine into the system. Arginine is turned into nitrous oxide, which causes the vessel to dilate. It's the actual mechanism behind the flow-mediated dilation. And we could look at the dilation through arginine. So there's different studies. They looked at all the different studies looking at endothelium, and they concluded that extra virgin olive oil, without a doubt, has a beneficial effect. Now, the last thing I'll say about this is, so we've got studies now saying that the endothelium is in good hands under olive, not just okay, but actually better. Inflammation's down, all that kind of stuff. There was another study called the April study, which showed definite decrease in oxidation and inflammation after olive oil. So we know it's better, but you also have to remember that we're not as concerned. There's mechanistic studies. These are all what are called mechanistic studies. We could talk about the mechanism of endothelial health. We could talk about nitrous oxide. The bottom line is, do you get more heart disease if you take olive oil? And the bottom line answer is no. In fact, in multiple meta-analyses with systemic evaluation, you actually get less heart disease with olive oil. So I think olive oil is actually very good for your endothelium, and I think it's good for preventing heart disease.
You know, one of the first questions I asked about olive oil was the way that it's consumed, right? And so, Rip, I think that I remember attending Plant Stock. It was my wife and I's 10-year anniversary, and I actually met Garth there too. And, you know, for me, there's this lasting image that I have of you going like this with the circle, with a spray can of oil. And that's not the type of oil, by the way, that Garth is talking about, right? It is that you going boop on the skillet. And it's just a bunch of added extra stuff. Now, I don't know the quality of, you know, the Pam sprays or the cooking sprays out there, but I can imagine it's not as good as a fresh pressed, harvested at peak, cold pressed olive oil, right? And so, Rip, as we start to think about how we use olive oil in our lives, I feel like you might have seen a gross misuse of olive oil in not only extreme heat, but also buying it from the grocery store where it's oftentimes got a 3-year shelf life, rancid, things of that nature. But as you hear about things like the endothelial lining and things of that nature, I know that might not be your focus point especially, but how does it hit you when you hear about cold pressed fresh olive oil?
Yeah, I don't know if I've actually ever had cold pressed fresh olive oil. You have to tell me where to go to get some of that stuff. But you know, to Garth's point about polyphenols, so I just have a question, Garth. You mentioned that cold pressed extra virgin olive oil has 300. I think you said 300 or whatever.
Yeah.
That per what? Is that per tablespoon? Is that per?
No, it's per kilogram.
Okay, per kilogram. So, because the reason why I asked you that is because, what I'm showing is that 3.5 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil have about 55 milligrams of polyphenols. And just to put that into perspective for everybody, you can get, and that's 3.5 tablespoons, and that's 420 calories that you have to consume to get those 55 milligrams of polyphenols. Whereas you could eat basically 23 calories of plums and get 188 milligrams. You could eat 16 calories of red onions and get 84 milligrams, and 290 calories of almonds and get 94 milligrams of the polyphenol. So my point being is that I think there's smarter ways to get your polyphenols than olive oil, which if that's, and I'm glad you brought this up, Garth, because like when I ask people, why are you consuming olive oil? The two big things are antioxidants and polyphenols. That is unequivocally what people shout from the mountaintops. And so when I look into it, and I'd like to know if you agree with this, Garth. When it comes to antioxidants, basically it's A, C, E, and selenium. There's no vitamin E to speak of. There's no C to speak of. There's no selenium. There are trace amounts of vitamin E, but it's like minimal. So to give you an idea, you'd have to consume 1 tablespoon, 120 calories of olive oil to get 1.9 milligrams of vitamin E. Whereas you could do a cup of cooked spinach at 7 calories, and that would yield you 3.7 milligrams. You could have one small red bell pepper, and that would give you 2.1 milligrams, which is more than the olive oil. You could have a cup of cooked broccoli, which is 31 calories and 2.3 milligrams. So my point being there is that, if when you're eating the whole food, I'm getting just as much vitamin E with a lot less calories and a lot more fiber, protein, carbohydrates, more vitamins, more minerals, fiber that is obviously sorely lacking in extra virgin olive oil. And then the polyphenols that I mentioned there. So I don't see how those trace amounts of vitamin E and the polyphenols are going to get us to the promised land in something that is so calorie dense.
Dr. Davis, your response?
Yeah. So this has got to be the crux of the issue, right? And I'll make it even a more difficult argument for me. Why not just eat the olives, right? Why not just eat the olive? Because the olive probably has all these same things in it, right? So there probably is in the olive. So every food's got its different kind. Look, you might have heard of the fuss now with urolithin A. I don't know if you have, but it comes from pomegranates. And so each there's different anthocyanins and all these different chemicals, and each fruit or vegetable has something that's special. Scientists are thinking that some of the polyphenols in olive oil, olives in general, are special. They're just different. They're more active than others that you might find. So when we say polyphenols, there's a million different polyphenols, right? So there might be a polyphenol you're talking about in coffee. There's a different kind of polyphenol on tea. And so there's a polyphenol mixture in olive oil. There's about 30 different polyphenols in olive oil. You'll hear people talk about hydroxytyrosol and oleocanthal, and these are supposed to be the actual specific ones that are actually beneficial to the endothelium and what are thought to help. But obviously, those are going to be in the olive itself. I don't know if you've ever picked an olive and eaten it. Have you ever been to an actual olive farm and picked an olive and eaten it?
No.
It's horrible. All right. It is horrible. It is very bitter and tastes terrible. That bitter taste comes from one of the polyphenols. Now, when you eat an olive, typically those olives, like if you buy a Spanish olive, they're fermented in order to get rid of the bitter taste. In America, it's either brine washed, so you're getting a lot of salt with it, or it is actually chemically treated in order to get rid of that. And so when you're eating an olive, they take out some of these polyphenols. The other thing is that they harvest it when it's ripe, whereas with really good extra virgin olive oil, they harvest it before it's ripe. It's almost like, if you want to resist starch, you eat a unripened banana. It's something like this, is if we want to get the right amount of polyphenols, we got to get it when it's unripe. So there may be a little bit of magic in the olive oil in that you are getting it in a way that you probably couldn't consume it in an olive because it would taste terrible. Now, can I prove that? No, there's no study really that is looking at olive oil versus olives. There was a randomized controlled trial similarly looking at olive oil versus olives done by Dr. Agarwal, but she didn't really look at any outcomes except for LDL cholesterol. And the whole food plant-based diet without oils is going to have a lower LDL. But when you look at the prevention trials with olive oil, like the Predimed study, which is famous everywhere, where they had to stop the study early because there was so much of a benefit in the high olive oil group to preventing heart disease, they were preventing heart disease, but there was no change in LDL cholesterol. So decreasing LDL cholesterol is great, but we've shown that olive oil helps without decreasing. So telling me that a whole food plant-based diet will reduce your LDL cholesterol more doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have better heart outcomes with the whole food plant-based diet. So the answer is we just haven't tested it. Do I think that people have to have olive oil in order to be healthy? No. Look at Rip's mom. It's about the healthiest woman ever. I saw her with a tire strapped around her walking up
all the
hill.
time.
I don't think you have to have olive oil. I'll tell you what concerns me though. Okay, olive oil tastes great. All right, especially extra virgin olive oil, peppery, really good. It's a great way to be able to prepare food. So I saute, vegetables and roast with it. And so in my mind, I want plant-based diets to be as accessible as possible. Do you have to have the olive oil? No. But if you add it, are you going to be sick? No.
Yeah. So I'd love to respond to some of that. So you said a lot there, Garth.
Sorry if I took a little bit too much there.
No. But, first of all, you mentioned that PREDIMED study that was stopped after 4.8 years. There was, just for the audience, there was 3 randomized groups. One was on a control group. They were just told to, eat if you can a low-fat diet, but eat whatever you want. Then there was a Mediterranean diet that had nuts, and it was 30 grams of nuts a day, 15 grams of walnuts, 7.5 grams of almonds, and 7.5 grams of hazelnuts. And then a Mediterranean diet group with extra virgin olive oil, and that was 50 grams that you talked about earlier, Garth, and that's the equivalent of, just so everybody can put that into perspective, that's 4 tablespoons. And, yes, it was stopped after 4.8 years, but, there were almost 300 major cardiovascular events that occurred over that 4.8 years. There were 96 major events in the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil group. There were 83 in the Mediterranean diet and nut group, and 109 in the control group. So to me, the extra virgin olive oil was almost the same as the control group that was doing absolutely nothing. So, and then, of the people that started this, and everybody that started this, they could not have clinical signs of heart disease. So over the 4.8 years, these people developed heart disease. And then when it came to diabetes, at follow-up after 4.1 years, there were 273 new cases of onset diabetes, 80 in the extra virgin olive oil group, 92 in the nut group, and 101 in the control group. So I don't see any of those diets as kind of being the promised land that a whole food plant-based diet without oil is. Now, Garth, you also mentioned the study by our fantastic friend, Monica Agrawal, right? Who, just so people understand who she is, she's board certified in general cardiology, nuclear cardiology, and lipidology, adjunct associate professor in the University of Florida's Division of Cardiology, Medicine. She's the current nutrition chair at the American College of Cardiology. And she wrote the paper you referred to, this was in the Journal of American Heart Association, August 6, 2024. So it's very, very recent. And it was titled Recipe for Heart Health, a randomized crossover trial on cardiometabolic effects of extra virgin olive oil within a whole food, plant-based vegan diet. And to your point, Garth, it investigated how varying amounts of extra virgin olive oil in a whole food, plant-based vegan diet affect cardiometabolic risk factors in adults at risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, you mentioned that the only thing that it really kind of showed was LDL cholesterol. And I just want to address some other measures that it found. So this is just some of the findings. I'm reading this from the study. Both high and low extra virgin olive oil diets resulted in significant reductions in LDL compared to baseline. So that's a win for both of us, Garth, right?
Right.
Significant reductions for both. Like, good. Go team whole food plant-based. However, greater reductions were observed after the low extra virgin olive oil diet. And just so people understand, There were 40 participants, 30 women, 10 men. She divided them up 20 and 20 for 4 weeks. One group was consuming 4 tablespoons of added olive oil with a whole food plant-based diet. The other group was consuming really no added oil, less than 1 teaspoon per day for 4 weeks. And then they did a washout where they did whatever they wanted for the next week. And then they switched, and the low oil group did the high oil, et cetera. So this was some of the results. However, greater reductions were observed after the low extra virgin olive oil diet, specifically in the first 4-week period. LDL decreased by 25.5 milligrams per deciliter following the low extra virgin olive oil diet, and by 16 after the high EVOO diet. Notably, adding extra virgin olive oil after a low intake period, the low to high sequence, led to increases in the LDL by 15.8 milligrams per deciliter. And the LDL, I mean, that's the lethal cholesterol. It is very, very important. And I want to just make a note here, Garth, before I turn it over to you, that for every, and this is written up in the paper, and this is common knowledge in the medical field, but for every 1 millimole per liter, which is the equivalent of 38 milligrams per deciliter drop in LDL cholesterol, is associated with a reducing risk of major vascular events by 25%. So in the high to low, after consuming the high olive oil for 4 weeks and then going to low, their LDL decreased by 11 points, which cut their risk of cardiovascular disease by 8%. And in the group that went from low to the high, their LDL increased 15 points, which increased their risk of cardiovascular disease by 19%. So to me, those aren't nothing. In addition to that, Garth, you mentioned there was nothing else. Total cholesterol, apolipoprotein B, and high density lipoprotein cholesterol all decreased on both diets, but there was more pronounced reductions following the low extra virgin olive oil diet. Just to give you an example, total cholesterol decreased by 33 in the low oil compared to 19 in the high. When it came to glycemic control, the glucose decreased greater in the low oil. Inflammatory markers both did great, right? There was no difference in either of those. And then when it came to weight, the low oil actually lost an additional 1.5 pounds, which is 18 pounds over a year. So I'll stop there, but that's for starters on that study.
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, a lot of those things were not statistically significant. So
But clinically meaningful.
Yeah, clinically meaningful. I mean, the weight loss, they were eating 1,300 calories, but when you added it, they were eating 1,800 calories. You're going to see a weight loss differential.
Yeah, 1334 to 1776. Yep.
Yeah, so there was a big difference in calorie intake. You're going to expect a little bit of weight loss, and it wasn't even significant. I would have expected more. If you look at the weight loss studies, that's another thing we could get into. Because my big worry with ever saying olive oil is okay is the weight, because this is a calorie-dense food. But it's amazing, and there's a great randomized controlled trial that's looking at this. A meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, and actually olive oil is associated with weight loss over time. Olive oil. Now, this is out of Harvard. Regular oils are not. So why would olive oil be associated with weight loss, but regular oils are not? And this may have to do, again, with the polyphenols and the polyphenol effect on microbiome. We found that the polyphenols from olive oil actually give you a much more varied microbiome, a change in the Bacteroides and Firmicutes, which is associated with changes in weight. And so I haven't been as worried about it. Obviously, if you're going to drink it like Dr. Gundry wants you to do, it's going to be an issue, but in the doses that we're talking about. The other thing is the cholesterol is kind of interesting. In Agrawal's study, if you look at it, if you just look at the raw numbers, there's no difference in LDL cholesterol between the two groups. The only time she finds a difference is when you look at sequence. In other words, if you start with the high with the high olive oil, then you go to the low olive oil, that grouping, that kind of thing actually had the lowest LDL drop. But if you just look at the two groups, the high olive oil or the low olive oil, there was no difference in LDL. And so
I don't think that's accurate, but
it's 100%. I mean, if you look on our study, if you just look in our discussions, it's all about this is a sequence effect. Sequence effects are kind of weird in crossover studies. Now we're getting out of the realm of probably what people want to listen to. Sequence studies are a little bit hard because if you've got something where if you look at the raw numbers, there's not a difference, but there is a difference in sequence, you then have to worry, is this an effect? In other words, was there a good effect from the olive oil over the 2 weeks prior to the washout and it hadn't completely washed out yet, so it was having an effect afterwards? You understand what I'm saying? It's a bias, basically. It's a problem with crossover studies when you get these results. But the final thing is that, yes, LDL dropping is really important. But again, if you look at our primary prevention studies like the Predimed study, and if you look at the Cordioprov study for secondary prevention, these did, even though there were still heart diseases, as Rip picks up, because these people are not eating a plant-based diet like we talk about. They're still eating, some meat and things like that. They're just doing more of olive oil or not. These groups had a decrease in the amount of heart disease or heart events without a change in LDL. So there's something that olive oil does outside of LDL to help it. I'm surprised there aren't increases in LDL. Like Rip pointed out, both groups dropped LDL. Olive oil does have saturated fat in it. It is 14% saturated fat, which typically I would tell people never to touch. But again, these polyphenols seem to have something that will counteract that effect.
Yeah. So you mentioned saturated fat. I'd love to talk about that for just a second, because I'm dubious. I think that the public, Garth, has been led to believe that olive oil is it's the Mediterranean wonder elixir, and more is better. And I think that, to your point, it's 14% saturated fat. You seem to claim that the polyphenols will overrule that. I think that's a dangerous game. But the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association, both recommend that our caloric consumption of saturated fats should be no more than 5 to 6% of our overall total calories. You look at the data right now, and this is just an interesting side. And actually, I'll come back to that. 5 to 6% of total calories. If you look at Monica Agrawal's study, what you'll see, and I'm trying to get this straight so everybody in the audience can understand, 6% of calories from saturated fat equates to 13 grams. And all the people that were consuming the baseline diet before they joined Monica's study were consuming roughly 23 grams of saturated fat per day. Now, in the extra virgin olive oil high group, 4 tablespoons a day, and this is in the appendix, as you pointed out, Garth. Mm-hmm. The high extra virgin olive oil group was consuming 16 grams a day, and the low group was consuming 10, which is good, right? That's healthy. That's below that 13 grams that the American College of Cardiology has determined we want to be below. So I'm a huge fan of that for that reason. And I think that the, 1, 2, 3, 4 tablespoons of olive oil or some kind of oil a day will put you over that level pretty easily. The numbers, like, olive oil's one of the lower saturated fat oils, but, soybean, peanut, rice bran are all between 16 to 20% saturated fat. Now, are they better than butter or lard or Crisco? Absolutely. They're 60, 40, and 30% saturated fat. But here's my side point, and then I'll turn it over to you again, Garth, is that you look at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and basically they're saying that 10 to 12% of America's calories are coming from saturated fat. And in a study that was study published in the Journal of American Medical Association 2016, showed that saturated fat intake has increased from 11.5 to 12% between 1999 and 2016. And a large part of this is because of olive oil, right? America's fascination with olive oil. So I just think, and I'll go back to Garth, I think it's a dangerous game that people think that olive oil is a health elixir and more is better. Like, for example, do you have a recommendation for your patients? Like, I want you to consume 1 or 2 tablespoons a day?
I do 1.5, because that's what most of the studies are showing, is that 1.5 is where you get the benefits. A lot of the studies were looking at 4 tablespoons.
Yeah.
But 4 tablespoons is just too many calories for me, even with the data showing that it doesn't increase weight. I still, 4 tablespoons just seems to be a lot. So I usually stick with 1.5 with my patients.
Yeah. I mean, because 4 tablespoons, that's 480 calories, right?
It is.
I mean, that's not nothing. That's almost 25% of the recommended daily allowance.
So and if you look at the meta-analysis, if you look at the meta-analysis where they were Frank Hu's group out of Harvard looking at the meta-analysis of olive oil and weight loss, and if you actually look at the actual studies in the meta-analysis, most of them were looking at 20 to 30 grams, or about 1.5 tablespoons.
So let me ask you this. Do you think most people are consuming, outside of the whole food plant-based, world are able to contain themselves to 1.5 tablespoons a day?
I mean, look, I don't think very many people are getting extra virgin olive oil. I don't know. I mean, I think some people use olive oil. I mean, we're using much more seed oils. Again, I don't really think seed oils are that bad either, but we can talk about that in a different kind of conversation. I don't think, I mean, 1.5 tablespoons is a lot of olive oil. I don't know. When I was reading that, Frank, when I was reading Vogel's study, and they were giving people 50 grams of olive oil, I tried to get 50 grams of olive oil on a piece of bread, and it was like a sopping oily mess. And I was like, God, this is a lot of olive oil.
Well, that's 3.5 tablespoons. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, that's a lot. I think it's pretty easy to go through a day and get really good extra virgin olive oil and only get 1.5 tablespoons. I don't think that should be much of a problem. And I think there are some really good things you could get out of that.
Yeah. Well, you know what, you mentioned that Vogel study, and as you said, it's probably a little antiquated at this point, and it was mechanistic. But what I thought was interesting about that study was that he basically compared the olive oil against canola oil and salmon, right? Mm-hmm. And the only one that impaired endothelial function in that particular study was the olive oil.
Right. Yeah, it was. It was. He was surprised by the finding. I mean, Vogel, kind of puts in his discussion that, this surprised us. We thought we would find something better. But it's just since then there have been many, many studies repeating that and not finding the same. And I just wonder if it was too much oil at one time, or whether this oil just wasn't high quality oil, because there's no question there's a difference between a regular olive oil and a cold pressed extra virgin olive oil as far as polyphenol content is concerned.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that, I don't think we've talked about it yet in this conversation, and that is, a lot of these diets showing the benefits of extra virgin olive oil is when it's replacing animal fats like butter, like lard, like mayonnaise, meats, stuff like that. And I think absolutely that's going to be a much, smarter form of fat than these animal fats.
Gentlemen, I want to respect your time. Rip, I know you're busy inspiring people all over the world. And Garth, you're busy saving lives on the table every day. So I didn't want to let us go, though, without talking about inflammation, because it is a very hot topic. And when we talk about inflammation, would you call, I think I know the answer based on what we've already talked about, but would you call them pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory? And I guess I'll start with Garth. How, and we've talked about so many scientific studies. How do you support the argument that it is anti-inflammatory?
No, with science, right? I mean, there's multiple ways of looking and evaluating inflammation. You could evaluate it with C-reactive protein. You could evaluate it with IL-6. You could evaluate it with antioxidant content. You could evaluate it with peroxidation studies. There have been many, many studies on olive oil. Like I said, in 2015 in Nutrients, there's a great meta-analysis of the inflammatory effects of olive oil, and it shows just across the board a decrease in inflammation, across the board. And then there was a the April study was really good because it looked at extra virgin olive oil versus regular olive oil. And again, it showed that it was this extra virgin olive oil with its polyphenols that were giving it the anti-inflammatory effect. We know that polyphenols, that all these plant compounds that Rip and I love, that you get from all the different plant-based foods, are really like medicine to the body. Every time you eat, there was a fascinating study years ago. This guy, Dio Perkar, he took people, he gave them water. You drink water, nothing, right? No inflammation. He was looking at all kinds of things, toll receptor, everything you could think about to measure inflammation. Give people water, nothing. Give them sugar water, even sugar, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world, but sugar water, if you eat anything, you get reactive oxygen species. Part of creating energy creates a byproduct, which is inflammatory. Now, if you give someone orange juice, it drops that inflammation. And why does it drop it? Because of the antioxidants in the oranges. And so it's kind of the same way here. I do think that the polyphenols in olive oil are anti-inflammatory. It can counteract. I do think adding olive oil, for instance, to a salad is helpful because it helps the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. And this other thing that I've been very interested in and studying lately is this idea that if you could get fats to the distal intestine, you stimulate GLP-1, like the Ozempic shots that we give. And the combination of spinach with olive oil actually does that.
So I'd love to tackle that question too a little bit here.
Absolutely.
So as far as inflammation, is olive oil pro or anti-inflammatory? I would say, like, compared to what and how much? So compared to butter, I think it is absolutely inflammatory. Compared to canola oil, maybe. Compared to ground flaxseed meal, sure. And then, to answer Garth, Garth, you went through a pretty impressive list there of all the reasons why it's anti-inflammatory. One of them was, you said, the antioxidant content. And I just want to, which also includes the polyphenols. And I just want to say, I looked up in the antioxidant food table that has more than 3,100 different foods, beverages, spices, herbs, and supplements. And the antioxidant content in millimoles per 100 grams of food in olive oil, it's extra virgin olive oil, 0.23. It can vary from 0.23 to a high of 0.5, depending upon the different olives. Margarine is 0.44. Snickers bar is 0.73. Tootsie Rolls are 1.4. Dried amla berries, which, are the new kid on the block, these Indian gooseberries, 261. And then raspberries are 3.9. So to me, olive oil, it doesn't make the mark there when it comes to antioxidants.
Yeah, but I would just say, again, that's just looking at antioxidants. But if we're looking at end results, if we're looking at actual changes in inflammatory markers, and the funny thing about olive oil is, like, if you hear any of the experts talking about it, we don't exactly know where this magic is coming from, like which polyphenol is actually making this magic. But the anti-inflammatory effect is very dramatic. I mean, this is now amla would probably, I would imagine, would beat it, but a Snickers bar will not. So when you just look at the studies and you look at what the inflammatory markers, whether it's IL-6, CRP, what is happening, and you get a drop. And you're right that it's usually, in most of the studies, they're comparing it. Well, let's substitute, but some are not. Like if you look at the Attica study and the Meta study, they were looking at people that don't use any oil versus people that use a mixture of different oils versus people that use olive oil. And there was a clear decrease in inflammation in the olive oil group compared to the no oil group at all. And now they're not eating, the no oil group wasn't by any means eating a plant-based diet, but there was definitely a benefit to having olive oil over the no oil group, especially when it came to aging factors that they were looking at. Which was partly, the aging factors they were looking at were partly inflammatory factors, changes to DNA status, methylation, all these kind of crazy things. But it was definitely a benefit in the olive oil group.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our debate, and I want to make sure that I give you both a final word. And I'd like to start with Garth. The final question is very simple. It is simply, is olive oil a healthy food? And this is your opportunity to make your final case to the audience why we should or we should not include olive oil in a healthy diet. So, Garth, the floor is yours.
I think olive oil has proven itself over years. I mean, thousands of studies now. We've got meta-analyses looking at 32 different randomized controlled trials. We've got very large population trials showing that olive oil helps with things we didn't even talk about: diabetes, cognitive function, even weight loss. But the one thing that it is clearly beneficial with is decreasing heart disease, and we know that from very large studies. And I do think it could be a very healthy part of the diet. I don't think you're going to die if you don't eat it, but I think it is a tasty and healthy way to make a plant-based diet not only tastier but healthier.
Rip, same question for you, friend. Is olive oil a healthy food? Go ahead and make your final case to the audience.
Yeah. Well, let me say that more and more, as I get older and hopefully a little bit wiser, I am disliking the idea of defining a single food as either healthy or unhealthy. I think that it's really important that we look at the totality of somebody's diet and what are their personal goals? Like, what are they trying to achieve? And then, Cory and Garth, it becomes the decision that person wants to make that is healthy or unhealthy, and not the food. So let me give you some examples, like heart health, right? I would say if you've had, if you have heart disease, if you've had 2 stents, bypass surgery, I think it's probably not a wise decision for you to be consuming the olive oil. Now, this is an N of 2 or 3, but you guys know my father's research going back to 1984 and how closely he monitored all of his Walking Dead patients, and what he found because he asked some of them to start introducing olive oil right into their diets, and typically within a couple of weeks the angina would return. And so there's something about people that are kind of in that kind of a very precarious position where it's kind of like as a firefighter that you have these spot fires that you always have to put out, and the littlest little fire or little spark can ignite the whole thing. And so that's what he found, right? With some of these oils. Again, anecdotal. Garth, you mentioned diabetes. I think you'll find that Neil Barnhard, the guys at Mastering Diabetes, Cyrus and Robbie, that, probably not a wise decision if you're insulin resistant to be adding any more unnecessary, excessive calories, especially fat calories, to kind of block those insulin receptors. Look at Dr. Dean Ornish and his latest program trying to reverse and halt Alzheimer's. He was not a fan of the added oil. Now, you're a young 20-year-old athlete and you're burning, 4,000 calories a day, maybe. So I think it depends upon who you are, what your situation is, and then you make the decision that's best for you.
I cannot thank you both enough for taking the time to do this. We've been here for an hour. Like I said, we had over 10,000 people registered to attend this event. If they weren't able to watch live, there will be a replay, and this will live in perpetuity on the forksoverknives.com website as part of the Great Oil Debate article, where many of your colleagues have also commented and offered their feedback, thoughts, and insights on olive oil. So
can I want to say before we hang up, Garth, how much I appreciate you challenging the whole food, plant-based, no oil status quo, that has existed for a long time. And, I appreciate you kind of stepping outside the arena and challenging all of us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And love to your folks. Tell them I say hello.
Thanks.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.